It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Brooksville. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the little houses that lined the street. On the porch of one of those houses sat John Harris, a 93-year-old man who had seen more in his lifetime than anyone in this town could imagine. His hands, though wrinkled, were steady as he sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The peace of the moment was interrupted by the distant growl of engines. John didn't flinch. He had heard that sound before, many times in fact, over the past few weeks. It was the bikers again. Rex and his gang roared up to John's front yard, their laughter breaking the silence of the afternoon. Rex, the leader, was a towering figure, all leather and tattoos, with a sneer permanently etched on his face. The others followed suit, parking their bikes on John's lawn as if it were their personal garage. Well, if it isn't our favorite grandpa," Rex called out, hopping off his bike with a swagger. The others laughed, echoing their leader's arrogance. John didn't respond. He sat there, his calm demeanor unshaken by the intimidation tactics. This was not the first time the bikers had harassed him, and it wouldn't be the last. At least, that's what they thought. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Rex jeered, stepping closer. He knocked John's coffee cup from his hand, watching it shatter on the porch. John looked at the broken cup, then back at Rex, his eyes cold but composed. "You've had your fun. Now leave." "Oh, we're just getting started," Rex said, leaning in closer. "What are you going to do about it, old-timer? Call the cops? Go ahead. I'll be out in an hour. Tops." John's eyes didn't waver. "I'm not calling the cops." Rex paused for a second, confused by John's calmness. "Yeah? Then who are you going to call?" John stood up slowly, his joints creaking as he rose to his full height, still taller than Rex by a few inches. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. "I'm going to make one call," John said, his voice steady, "and when I do, you're all going to wish you never set foot on this lawn." For the first time, Rex faltered, but he quickly covered it with a laugh. "Yeah, right. Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters?" John's eyes narrowed, and with a simple push of a button, the phone began to ring. As the phone rang in John's hand, Rex's laughter echoed around the yard. The bikers joined in, amused by the audacity of the old man. They had been pushing him for weeks, vandalizing his property, harassing him in the streets, and no one in the small town dared to stand up to them. Why would today be any different? But something in John's demeanor unsettled Rex. Despite his confident facade, a small voice in the back of his mind warned him to tread carefully. There was something about the way John held himself, unshaken, resolute, that didn't fit the image of a frail, helpless old man. "Who's on the other end of that phone, old man? Your bingo buddies?" Rex taunted, stepping closer. "Let me guess. They're coming to scare us off, right?" John didn't reply. His eyes remained locked on Rex, and the sound of the ringing phone hung in the air. Rex was losing his patience. He grabbed the phone from John's hand and looked at the screen. "Just one call, huh?" Rex sneered. "Let's see who you're bothering." Before Rex could hang up, a voice answered on the other end. John spoke calmly, his tone unwavering. "Ethan, it's time. Activate the protocol." Rex frowned, the phone still in his hand. "Protocol? What kind of nonsense is this?" John simply looked at Rex, his expression never changing. "You'll find out soon enough." For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Rex tossed the phone back to John, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're just an old man with nothing left. I don't care who you think you are. We run this town now." John remained unfazed, his calm gaze making Rex increasingly uneasy. The bikers were still laughing, but their leader wasn't as sure of himself as before. There was something about the old man's confidence that bothered him, and he didn't like it one bit. "Come on, let's get out of here. This geezer's not worth our time," one of the bikers muttered. The others grumbled in agreement, but Rex wasn't ready to leave just yet. "No," Rex growled, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to teach this old man a lesson." He stepped closer to John, his hand raised as if to strike, but before he could do anything, John's phone buzzed with a text message. John calmly opened it, his lips curling into a slight smile. Rex snatched the phone again and looked at the message. His face twisted into confusion. The message was from Ethan, and it read, "Target locked. Phase 1 initiated." "What the hell is this?" Rex spat, shoving the phone back at John. John didn't reply. He simply turned and walked back to his house, leaving Rex standing there, fuming with unanswered questions. Rex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he led his gang back to the clubhouse, the laughter and bravado had faded. His mind raced with questions about the strange phone call and the cryptic message. What did protocol mean? Why did the old man seem so unfazed by their threats? Back at the clubhouse, Rex tried to push the doubts from his mind. He gathered the gang, talking tough, planning their next moves, but deep down he couldn't let go of that nagging feeling. Later that night, Rex's phone buzzed. It was a message from his bank. He opened it and stared in disbelief. "Your account has been temporarily frozen due to suspicious activity." "What the hell?" Rex muttered, checking his other accounts. Each one gave the same message: frozen. Confused and enraged, he called the bank, but all he got was a vague explanation about unusual transactions and a warning that it might take days to resolve. Rex slammed the phone down, cursing under his breath. Was this a coincidence? Could John really have something to do with it? As Rex wrestled with his frustration, he wasn't the only one feeling the heat. His gang members started receiving similar messages: bank accounts frozen, credit cards declined, and strange charges appearing on their records. It was as if their lives were being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Meanwhile, John sat in his living room, watching the events unfold in real time on his computer screen. Ethan had set up a secure connection, feeding him updates from his operations. The bikers had no idea that their financial lives were being torn apart by a 93-year-old man and his tech-savvy grandson. "They're starting to feel it." Ethan's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "Their accounts are frozen, and I flagged their names with every financial institution we could access. By tomorrow, they won't even be able to buy a cup of coffee without raising red flags." John nodded, satisfied but calm. "Good work, Ethan. But we're not done yet." "There's more?" Ethan asked, curious about his grandfather's next move. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with determination. "I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. We're going to shut them down completely, financially, legally, and physically." The next phase of their plan was already in motion. John had used his contacts from his military days to gather intelligence on Rex and his gang. What Ethan had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. The bikers were involved in far more than petty harassment. They had deep ties to organized crime, and John had every intention of exposing them. The next morning, Rex woke to chaos. Half of his gang was in disarray. Some had been arrested overnight for outstanding warrants. Others were scrambling to figure out how their lives had been turned upside down. Rex's phone was blowing up with messages, each one more frantic than the last. "This doesn't make any sense," Pete, one of his most loyal followers, said. "It's like someone's watching everything we do." Rex slammed his fist on the table. "This has to be that old man. He's doing something to us." "How?" Pete asked, looking around nervously. "He's just one guy." Rex didn't have an answer, but he was determined to find out. He wasn't about to let some old man ruin everything he had built. "Get the bikes ready," Rex ordered. "We're paying him another visit." But as they prepared to leave, a convoy of unmarked cars pulled up outside the clubhouse. Men in suits stepped out, flashing badges. "FBI, stay where you are." Rex froze. He had known his gang was involved in illegal activity, but he never expected it to come crashing down like this. As he was cuffed and led away, his mind raced back to John's words. "You're all going to wish you never set foot on this lawn." As Rex was being taken away in handcuffs, his mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Just hours ago, he was the one in control, terrorizing the town with his gang, untouchable by the locals or law enforcement. Now, everything was crumbling in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. But one thought dominated his mind. John Harris. How had that old man managed to do this? Back at John's house, the elderly veteran watched from his porch as the unmarked cars drove past. He knew that this was just the beginning. The plan was working, but there was still more to do. Rex was only a piece of the puzzle, and John's years of experience told him that the bigger threat was still out there. His phone rang. It was Ethan. "Grandpa, they got Rex. He's being taken in for questioning. The feds were all over it, just like you said they would be." John nodded, his voice calm. "Good. But this isn't over yet, Ethan. We need to dig deeper. Rex may be out of the picture for now, but there are others. We have to make sure they all go down." Ethan's fingers flew across his keyboard. "I'm on it. I'll keep digging into their connections. I've already flagged a few more accounts tied to the syndicate." John's eyes darkened. "Don't stop until we have everything. I want every last one of them taken down." Later that evening, John sat in his study, staring at a photograph of himself and his old military unit. The picture was worn and faded, but the memories were as sharp as ever. These were the men he had fought beside, the ones who had trusted him with their lives. And now, decades later, some of those same men were still by his side, albeit in different ways. He picked up the phone again, this time dialing a number he hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "John Harris," the voice said. "It's been a long time." "Too long, McCaffrey," John replied, recognizing the voice of his old commanding officer. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end. "What kind of favor are we talking about?" "The kind that involves taking down a criminal syndicate," John said bluntly. "I've got the intel, but I need the manpower." McCaffrey chuckled. "You always did know how to dive straight into the deep end, didn't you? Send me what you've got. I'll mobilize my contacts, and we'll make sure this thing gets shut down for good." John felt a sense of relief. McCaffrey was one of the few men he could trust to handle something of this magnitude. And with his influence in government and military circles, John knew they had a fighting chance to not only stop the bikers, but also dismantle the larger criminal organization behind them. Meanwhile, in a nondescript office building hundreds of miles away, a man sat behind a large desk reviewing a file. His name was Victor Lang, and he was one of the most powerful men in the criminal underworld. He had connections in almost every major illegal enterprise, and his influence reached far beyond local gangs like Rex's. But now, something had come across his desk that concerned him. The file in front of him contained detailed reports of arrests, financial freezes, and FBI investigations, many of which were directly tied to Rex's gang. This kind of attention was bad for business. It was clear that someone had interfered, someone who had resources and the ability to take down an entire operation in a matter of days. Victor picked up the phone and made a call. "We have a problem," he said. "I need you to find out who's behind this. I want them dealt with, quietly." The voice on the other end simply replied, "Consider it done." Victor hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating his next moves. He knew that the key to surviving in this business was staying one step ahead, and whoever had disrupted his operations was about to learn just how dangerous it could be to cross Victor Lang. Back in Brooksville, life seemed to return to normal. With Rex and several of his gang members in custody, the town felt a renewed sense of peace. But John knew better. This was only a temporary reprieve. The real battle was just beginning, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. One afternoon, as John sat on his porch, Ethan pulled up in his car, a laptop in hand. He had been working non-stop, tracking down every lead, every loose end connected to Rex's operation. And now he had something to show his grandfather. "Grandpa, you need to see this," Ethan said, setting up the laptop on the porch table. John watched as Ethan pulled up a series of files, each one detailing bank transfers, shell companies, and offshore accounts. It was a web of corruption and criminal activity that reached far beyond what they had initially suspected. "This is bigger than Rex," Ethan said. "I've traced the money back to someone named Victor Lang. He's connected to everything: drug trafficking, arms dealing, you name it. And Rex's gang was just one of his small operations." John's jaw tightened. "Victor Lang," he muttered. I've heard that name before. He's dangerous. Ethan nodded. I've already flagged his accounts, but he's got too many layers of protection. We're going to need more than just hacking skills to take him down. John's mind raced. Victor Lang was no small-time criminal. He was a mastermind, someone who had built an empire on illegal activities. Taking him down would require more than just freezing accounts. It would require a coordinated effort, one that involved more than just John and Ethan. We're going to need McCaffrey, John said, and we're going to need to be careful. Victor Lang won't go down without a fight. John made another call to McCaffrey, laying out the details of what they had uncovered. McCaffrey, true to his word, had already mobilized his contacts, and within hours a task force was being assembled. But McCaffrey had a warning for John. Lang is a different breed, McCaffrey said. He's smart and he's ruthless. If we go after him, we have to be prepared for retaliation. I know the risks, John replied, but this needs to end. We've come too far to back down now. McCaffrey agreed. All right then, we're in this together. I'll coordinate with the feds and we'll make sure Lang is taken out of play, but you need to stay out of sight for now. If Lang gets wind that you're involved, he won't hesitate to come after you. John understood the gravity of the situation. Lang wasn't just a local thug like Rex. He had the resources to reach anyone, anywhere. But John wasn't afraid. He had faced worse enemies in his time, and he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions now. As John hung up the phone, he looked out at the horizon, the weight of the impending battle heavy on his shoulders. But he knew one thing for certain. He had spent his life protecting the innocent, and he wasn't about to stop now. In the weeks that followed, John, Ethan, and McCaffrey worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The feds were now involved, building a case against Victor Lang and his sprawling criminal empire. But as the net tightened around Lang, he became more unpredictable, and John knew it was only a matter of time before Lang struck back. Ethan had been monitoring all digital channels, and one evening, something troubling appeared on his radar. A private message, encrypted but traceable, sent to one of Lang's top lieutenants. The message contained John's name and a chilling set of instructions. "They know it's you, Grandpa," Ethan said, his voice tense as he showed John the message. "Lang's ordered a hit. They're coming for you." John remained calm, though he felt the weight of Ethan's words settle over him. This was no longer about a battle of wits or strategy. This had become personal. Lang's men were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their boss's empire. "Then we'll be ready," John said, his voice steady. "It's time to go on the offensive." As night fell, John prepared his house for what was to come. He had been in more dangerous situations before, but this time it was different. He wasn't just defending himself. He was protecting Ethan and the town from a man who had no limits. John's years of military training kicked in, his mind sharp and methodical. Ethan watched as his grandfather set up various security measures around the house, hidden cameras, alarms, and makeshift traps that could slow down anyone attempting to break in. Despite his age, John moved with a sense of purpose, his actions precise and calculated. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Ethan asked, his concern growing. "We don't have a choice," John replied. "Lang's men won't stop until they finish the job, but they've underestimated us." Ethan nodded, trusting his grandfather's judgment, though the tension in the air was palpable. Every shadow outside seemed to move, and every sound felt like a warning of the impending storm. As they waited for the inevitable, John received a call from McCaffrey. The task force was moving in on Lang's operations across the country, and they had already taken down several key players. But Lang himself remained elusive, his location still unknown. "We're close, John," McCaffrey said, "but you need to hold tight. Don't engage unless you have no other choice. We'll take care of Lang." "I'm not one to sit and wait," John replied, his tone firm, "but I'll do what I have to." McCaffrey understood. John had always been a man of action, but this situation required caution. The last thing they needed was for John to get caught in the crossfire. As the call ended, John and Ethan heard the faint sound of motorcycles in the distance. The bikers were coming, just as Lang had ordered. The roar of engines grew louder, and soon the headlights of motorcycles appeared at the edge of John's property. It was clear that Lang had sent some of his best men, hardened criminals who had no qualms about doing whatever it took to eliminate their target. John and Ethan watched from inside the house as the bikers parked their bikes and approached. They moved with confidence, expecting an easy job. After all, they were dealing with a 93-year-old man and his grandson. How hard could it be? But John had other plans. As the first biker stepped onto the porch, a hidden alarm was triggered, alerting John to their exact position. With a swift motion, John activated a series of security measures. Lights flashed on, alarms blared, and a high-pitched screech filled the air, disorienting the attackers. "Stay low," John whispered to Ethan as they moved to a more secure position inside the house. The bikers, now thrown off balance, tried to regain their composure, but John's traps had been carefully set, and within moments, 2 of them were caught in snare-like devices that immobilized them. The leader of the group, a hulking man named Snake, wasn't so easily deterred. He barked orders to his men, smashing through the door with a crowbar, but as he entered the house, he was met with a different kind of resistance. John stood waiting, his old military-issued shotgun in hand aimed directly at Snake. "This is your last chance to walk away," John said, his voice calm but commanding. Snake sneered, unfazed by the sight of the elderly man. "You think you can take me, old man?" John's eyes didn't waver. "I've taken down worse than you." In a swift motion, Snake lunged forward, but John was ready. With expert precision, John fired a warning shot that grazed Snake's shoulder, sending him stumbling back in shock. Snake cursed, gripping his bleeding shoulder, but before he could react, more flashing lights filled the night. Unmarked cars sped onto the property, and federal agents poured out, guns drawn, ready to take down Lang's men. McCaffrey had sent backup just in time. The raid was swift and efficient. Lang's men were no match for the coordinated effort of the federal agents. One by one, the bikers were taken down, handcuffed, and loaded into waiting vehicles. Snake, still clutching his wounded shoulder, glared at John as he was led away. "You'll pay for this," Snake growled, his eyes filled with hate. John remained stoic, watching as the last of the bikers was taken away. He knew that this was far from over. Snake was just a pawn in Lang's game, and the real threat was still out there. As the dust settled, McCaffrey arrived, walking up to John with a look of admiration. "Still as sharp as ever, I see," McCaffrey said, clapping John on the back. "Old habits die hard," John replied with a small smile. "But this isn't over yet." McCaffrey nodded. "We're closing in on Lang. We've already seized millions of dollars in assets and shut down several of his operations, but we still haven't located him." John's expression hardened. "He'll come for me. I know he will, and when he does, I'll be ready." As John and Ethan sat in the aftermath of the raid, there was a sense of temporary relief. The immediate danger had been neutralized, but the looming threat of Victor Lang still hung over them like a dark cloud. Ethan looked at his grandfather, admiration in his eyes. "How did you know exactly what to do?" John chuckled softly. "Years of experience, kid. You learn to be prepared for anything." But as they sat there, Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message. His face paled as he read it. "What is it?" John asked, sensing the sudden tension. Ethan turned the phone toward his grandfather, showing him the message. It was from an unknown number, and it contained only 3 words. "I'm coming, John." Victor Lang had made his move. John stared at the message on Ethan's phone. He had expected this, but it didn't make the threat any less real. Victor Lang was not a man to be taken lightly, and now John knew that Lang would stop at nothing to eliminate the man who had dismantled his empire. But John wasn't afraid. He had faced worse odds before, and if Lang wanted a fight, he would get one. "We need to prepare," John said quietly, his mind already calculating their next moves. Ethan's fingers flew across his laptop. "I'm tracing the message. If I can figure out where Lang is hiding, we might be able to stop him before he reaches us." John nodded, appreciating his grandson's quick thinking. "Do it, but stay focused. Lang's going to be more dangerous than ever. As Ethan worked, John made another call to McCaffrey. They needed to coordinate a final strike on Lang before he could retaliate. Time was running out, and John knew that their window of opportunity was closing fast. Hours passed, and tension hung thick in the air. Ethan's screen blinked as the trace narrowed in on Lang's location. "Got him," Ethan said, his voice tight with anticipation. "He's holed up in an old warehouse outside of town. It's heavily guarded, but we have a shot at taking him down if we move fast." John picked up his shotgun, his face set in determination. "Then let's end this." McCaffrey's team was ready to move. They had mobilized agents and planned a coordinated strike on Lang's hideout. But John wasn't about to sit this one out. Despite his age, he knew that his experience and instincts were needed in the field. As the team approached the warehouse, John and McCaffrey rode in the lead vehicle. They knew this would be the final confrontation. Either they would take Lang down, or Lang would destroy everything they had worked for. The strike team moved in silently, surrounding the warehouse. The air was thick with anticipation, every creak of the building heightening the tension. Inside, Lang's men patrolled, unaware of the ambush that was about to hit them. John and McCaffrey exchanged a brief glance, their years of friendship and camaraderie shining through. They had been in battles like this before, but this one felt different. This was personal. As the team breached the warehouse, chaos erupted. Lang's men opened fire, but the federal agents were well prepared. The firefight was intense, with bullets flying and shouts echoing through the cavernous space. John moved through the chaos with surprising agility, his military training taking over. He made his way toward the heart of the warehouse, knowing that Lang would be there, waiting. John found Lang standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by monitors and papers. The crime boss was calm, almost eerily so, as if he had been expecting John all along. "So, we finally meet," Lang said, his voice cold. "I've heard a lot about you, John Harris. You've been a thorn in my side for too long." John leveled his shotgun at Lang, his fingers steady on the trigger. "It's over, Lang. You've lost." Lang chuckled, his eyes narrowing. "Do you really think this ends with me? There will always be another. You've wasted your time." John's eyes didn't waver. "Maybe, but you won't be around to see it." Lang's hand moved toward a gun on the desk, but before he could grab it, John fired a single shot. The blast echoed through the room, and Lang crumpled to the ground, defeated. John stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle was over, but the weight of it all lingered in the air. The aftermath of the strike left a sense of relief, but also a lingering tension. Victor Lang was dead, and his empire had been dismantled, but the scars of the battle would remain. McCaffrey's team swept through the warehouse, rounding up the last of Lang's men, while John and Ethan finally took a moment to breathe. As they walked out of the warehouse together, Ethan looked at his grandfather with a new sense of admiration. "You did it, Grandpa. It's over." John nodded, though his expression remained serious. "It's never really over, Ethan. There will always be people like Lang out there, but we did what we had to do." McCaffrey approached, clapping John on the back. "You saved a lot of lives today, John. I couldn't have done this without you." John gave a small smile. "It was a team effort, and I'm just glad we stopped him before it got any worse." As the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the scene, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight had been long and hard, but in the end they had prevailed. And for now, that was enough. With Victor Lang's empire in ruins, the town of Brooksville returned to its quiet, peaceful existence. The people who had once feared Rex's gang could now walk the streets without looking over their shoulders. John, once underestimated by so many, had proven that age was no barrier to strength, courage, and justice. Back at his porch, John sat in his familiar chair, the same one where this whole ordeal had begun. Ethan sat beside him, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced danger head-on, and together they had won. But as John gazed out at the horizon, he knew that this wasn't the end. There would always be new battles to fight, new challenges to face, and when the time came, he would be ready. This story reminds us that strength, wisdom, and bravery don't fade with age. John Harris may have been 93 years old, but he showed that true courage comes from within, and sometimes the most unexpected heroes are the ones who stand up when it matters most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling and inspiring tales. Share this video with your friends and family, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one phone call to change everything. When a gang of bikers entered Riverside Diner, their heavy boots echoing against the tiled floor. The hum of conversation in the diner fell silent as every head turned toward the group. They were known in the area for causing trouble wherever they went, but today they were in the mood for more than just loud jokes and dirty looks. Their leader, Mick, scanned the room with a cocky grin, his eyes locking onto a lone woman sitting quietly in the corner booth. She had a calm air about her, dressed in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, her attention seemingly focused on the sandwich in front of her. "Easy target," Mick muttered to his crew with a smirk. They chuckled and followed him as he swaggered toward her booth. The other diners exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to interfere. This gang had a reputation, and no one wanted to be their next victim. Mick stopped in front of the woman's table, planting both hands on the edge of her booth. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said loudly, leaning in so everyone could hear. "You're in my seat." The woman, Jessica Kane, didn't look up immediately. She calmly set her sandwich down, wiped her hands with a napkin, and finally raised her gaze to meet Mick's. Her expression was unreadable, but her piercing eyes froze him for a moment. "There are plenty of empty seats," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. Mick straightened, his grin faltering for a split second before he recovered. "I wasn't asking," he said, his tone sharpening. Behind him, the rest of the gang chuckled, egging him on. Jessica's eyes flicked to them briefly, then back to Mick. She didn't look nervous, but she didn't look angry either, just calm, unnervingly calm. "I'll say this once," she said, her voice low but carrying across the diner. "Walk away now." Mick blinked, confused for a moment. Then he barked a laugh, looking back at his crew as if to say, "Can you believe this?" "Lady," he said, leaning closer, "I don't know who you think you're talking to, but—" Before he could finish, Jessica moved. In a flash, she grabbed Mick's wrist, twisting it in a way that made him yelp in pain. With one smooth motion, she pulled him forward and slammed his arm onto the table, pinning him there. The diner gasped. Jessica leaned in slightly, her voice still calm but with a cold edge. "I warned you." Mick's crew lurched forward, but Jessica didn't flinch. With a quick shove, she released Mick, sending him stumbling back into his gang. He clutched his wrist, his face red with humiliation. "You're gonna regret that," Mick snarled, his voice shaking with anger. Jessica stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Her eyes met Mick's again, steady and unyielding. "No," she said simply. "You're the one who'll regret it." The gang hesitated, glancing at each other. Something about her calm demeanor made them second-guess themselves. "Let's go," one of them muttered, tugging at Mick's jacket. Mick growled under his breath but didn't argue. With a final glare at Jessica, he turned and stormed out, his crew following reluctantly. The sound of their boots and the slam of the diner door echoed in the stunned silence that followed. Jessica sat back down, picking up her sandwich as if nothing had happened. The other patrons stared, whispers spreading through the room. The waitress approached cautiously, her voice a mix of awe and nervousness. "Are you okay?" Jessica gave her a small nod. "Just fine, thanks." But as she watched the gang ride away through the window, her calm expression tightened. She knew this wasn't over. Men like Mick didn't walk away without retaliation, and when they came back, she'd be ready. The afternoon sun was still high as the sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, leaving the Riverside Diner in an uneasy quiet. Jessica Kane finished her sandwich with deliberate calm, though her eyes flicked occasionally to the door. The tension in the room had begun to ease, but the nervous glances from the other patrons lingered. "You really handled them," the waitress said quietly, approaching Jessica's table with a fresh pot of coffee. Her voice carried a mix of admiration and fear. "They're bad news around here, you know. Always causing trouble. No one stands up to them." Jessica gave her a faint smile. Sometimes standing up is the only choice. The waitress hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the coffee pot. "You should be careful. Mick doesn't let things go. He'll be back." Jessica nodded, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm counting on it." The waitress blinked, unsure of what to say, and walked back behind the counter. Jessica finished her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out to the parking lot. Her black SUV gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the dust-covered motorcycles that had just left. As she slid into the driver's seat, Jessica's mind was already working through scenarios. She had dealt with men like Mick before, arrogant, entitled, and dangerous when their pride was wounded. They would come back, and they wouldn't be alone. But Jessica wasn't worried. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a slim, black case. Inside was a satellite phone. She flipped it open, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. A voice answered after the second ring. "Kane, is that you?" "It's me," Jessica said, her tone even. "I might need some backup, just a precaution." "Where are you?" "Small diner off Highway 16, Jessica replied. "You'll know it when you see it." The voice on the other end hesitated, then said, "I'll put the word out, but are you sure you need it?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint smile. "Not yet. Just be ready." She hung up and slid the phone back into the case. For now, she was on her own. Meanwhile, Mick and his crew were tearing down the highway, the roar of their engines drowning out any conversation. But Mick's scowl said more than words could. His injured wrist throbbed, a constant reminder of the humiliation he'd suffered in front of his gang and the entire diner. "Can't believe she did that," muttered Roy, one of the younger bikers. "Did you see how fast she moved?" "Shut up," Mick snapped, his voice sharp enough to silence the group. They pulled into the dusty lot of a decrepit bar on the outskirts of town, their unofficial clubhouse. The interior smelled of stale beer and old leather. Mick slammed the door behind him as he stormed inside, grabbing a bottle from behind the counter and twisting it open with his good hand. "That woman," he growled, pacing back and forth, "thinks she can humiliate me in front of everyone?" "She wasn't normal," muttered Lance, the quietest of the group. "She had training." Mick spun on him. "What are you saying, she's some kind of cop?" "Maybe," Lance replied, his tone cautious. "Or military." "She didn't hesitate, Mick. She was calculating, controlled. That wasn't just some random diner customer." The others exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of Lance's words sinking in. Mick slammed the bottle onto the counter, the glass shattering. "I don't care who she is. No one does that to me and gets away with it." "What's the plan?" one of the bikers asked hesitantly. Mick's grin returned, cruel and full of malice. "We make her pay, tonight." Back at the diner, Jessica stayed parked for a moment, watching the horizon. She could feel the eyes of the remaining customers on her as they left, one by one. It wasn't fear she felt, it was preparation. She drove to the nearest motel and checked into a small, nondescript room. Once inside, she locked the door, pulled the curtains, and opened a concealed compartment in her suitcase. Inside was a standard-issue 9mm pistol, a tactical knife, and a compact first aid kit. Old habits die hard. Jessica inspected the gun, loaded it, and set it on the nightstand. She knew Mick and his crew wouldn't wait long. If they had any sense, they'd try to scare her first. If they didn't, they'd come straight for her. Either way, she was ready. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jessica sat by the window, her back straight, her senses on high alert. Memories of past missions flitted through her mind. Dusty deserts, jungle ambushes, and quiet moments of preparation before the storm. She had faced worse threats than a gang of overconfident bikers. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from the contact she'd called earlier. "Backup 30 minutes out. Stay safe." Jessica smiled faintly. She appreciated the gesture, but she didn't need saving. She just needed the odds to stay even. Mick and his crew weren't subtle. As night fell, the roar of motorcycles echoed through the quiet streets near the motel. Jessica's sharp ears picked up the sound before it even reached the parking lot. She moved swiftly, switching off the room's light and positioning herself near the window. The gang pulled in, their headlights cutting through the dark. Mick dismounted, his movements aggressive, his face twisted with anger. "She's here," he growled. The others followed his lead, pulling bats and chains from their bikes. Lance lingered at the back, his expression conflicted. "Are we sure about this?" Lance asked, his voice low. Mick turned on him, his temper flaring. "What? You scared of one woman?" "She's not just a woman," Lance muttered, but Mick wasn't listening. Jessica watched from the shadows as they approached. Her hand rested lightly on the pistol, but she didn't draw it yet. She wanted to see what their plan was. Mick gestured to the others to surround the building, clearly intending to trap her inside. Jessica's eyes narrowed. They were predictable, but that didn't make them less dangerous. Mick stepped closer to the door, his voice loud and mocking. "Hey, lady! Thought you could embarrass me and just walk away?" Jessica didn't answer. "Come on out," Mick continued, rattling the door handle. "Let's have a little chat." Still no response. Mick nodded to one of his men, who raised a bat and swung it at the window. The glass shattered, but as it did, a blinding light flashed from inside. Jessica had activated a small tactical strobe, momentarily disorienting the gang. In the chaos, she moved. The door swung open, and before Mick could react, Jessica stepped out, her posture calm, but her eyes blazing. "Last chance," she said, her voice cutting through the night. "Leave now." Mick recovered quickly, his rage overtaking his caution. "Get her!" he yelled. The first man lunged, swinging his chain, but Jessica sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. He cried out as the chain clattered to the ground. In the same motion, she delivered a precise kick to his knee, sending him sprawling. Another came at her with a bat, but Jessica ducked under the swing, landing a sharp elbow to his ribs. He doubled over, gasping. Mick and the others hesitated, their bravado fading as they realized they were outmatched. "You'll regret this," Mick snarled, reaching for a knife at his belt. Before he could act, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Mick froze, his head whipping toward the sound. Jessica's reinforcements had arrived. She smirked faintly, lowering her stance but keeping her gaze locked on Mick. "You're right," she said. "This isn't over, but it's over for tonight." The gang scattered, their confidence shattered. As they roared off into the night, Jessica stood in the parking lot, her silhouette framed by the flashing lights of approaching patrol cars. This was just the beginning. The chaos of the night lingered in the air as Jessica Kane stood outside the motel, watching the flashing patrol car lights illuminate the dark parking lot. She could still hear the fading roar of the bikers' motorcycles as they sped off into the night, tails tucked between their legs. The first officers on the scene were already moving toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of them asked, his flashlight aimed briefly at her face. Jessica gave a small nod, keeping her composure. "I'm fine. No one got hurt." She gestured to the shattered glass and scattered debris. "But they might have caused some damage." The officer, a young man whose badge read Thompson, took a quick look around, then exchanged a glance with his partner. "Did you get a good look at them, or their bikes?" "I got more than a good look," Jessica replied calmly. "You're looking for Mick Sanders and his crew. They're part of the Thunder Jackals." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "You know them?" Jessica met his gaze, her voice steady. "Let's just say we've crossed paths. They're the ones you'll want to question about the damage around here." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly noting her confidence and lack of fear. "All right," Thompson said, jotting notes into a small pad. "We'll file a report and pass it on to the sheriff. But, if you don't mind me asking, how'd you manage to scare them off?" Jessica tilted her head slightly, the barest hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I didn't scare them. They just realized they were outmatched." By the time the officers left, the motel manager had emerged, pacing anxiously around the parking lot and muttering about broken windows and potential lawsuits. Jessica gave him a brief apology, handed over some cash to cover the damages, and disappeared back into her room. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her mind began to calculate the next steps. She knew the type of man Mick Sanders was. He wouldn't take this lying down. His pride was too bruised, and his gang relied too heavily on the fear he instilled in others. He'd come back, and next time, he wouldn't just bring bats and chains. He'd bring the full weight of his ego-fueled rage. Jessica reached for her satellite phone and dialed a number. "Yeah?" came a gruff voice on the other end. "It's Kane," she said simply. "I need intel on Mick Sanders and the Thunder Jackals. Everything you can get me. Criminal records, associates, known hangouts." There was a pause. "You got it. Give me a few hours." Jessica hung up and leaned back against the headboard, her eyes closing briefly. Her training from her time as a Force Recon Marine kicked in, the old instincts sharp as ever. Preparation was everything, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. Miles away, at a run-down bar on the outskirts of town, Mick Sanders was nursing his bruised ego along with his fourth beer. His gang sat around him, some nursing injuries of their own, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm telling you, Mick," Lance said quietly, leaning forward from his seat at the bar. "We can't go at her again. She's not just some random woman. She knew what she was doing." Mick slammed his bottle down on the counter, making everyone flinch. "Shut it, Lance. I don't need you telling me how to handle this." Lance hesitated, but then pressed on. "Think about it. She disarmed all of us without breaking a sweat. And then the cops showed up out of nowhere. She's not just tough. She's connected." "She's nothing," Mick snarled, his voice venomous. "Just another wannabe tough girl who got lucky. Next time, I'll put her in her place." One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy named Pete, spoke up hesitantly. "What if she's ex-military or something? She moved like a pro, Mick. We're not equipped for that kind of fight." Mick's eyes narrowed, his frustration boiling over. "I don't care who she is. No one humiliates me like that." He stood abruptly, pointing a finger at his crew. "You're either with me or you're out. We're paying her another visit tomorrow, and this time, we're ending it." The room fell silent. Some nodded reluctantly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Lance said nothing, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Jessica's phone buzzed just as the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the curtains. She answered immediately. "It's me," the voice on the other end said. "Got what you asked for. Mick Sanders, mid-level thug with a laundry list of petty crimes. Assault, vandalism, extortion. Nothing major, but enough to keep him out of trouble with the bigger players. His gang's small but dangerous, around 15 members total, most of them local misfits." Jessica frowned slightly. "Any affiliations?" "None worth noting. They're not connected to any major crime networks, but they've made plenty of enemies. My guess? Mick's trying to prove himself. He's got something to prove, and you're the wrong person to get in his way." Jessica nodded to herself. "What about their location?" "They're holed up at the Iron Horn, an old bar about 10 miles out of town. That's their base. They've been quiet since last night, but my guess is they're gearing up for something. Be careful." "Always," Jessica replied, ending the call. She stood, stretching out the stiffness from the night before, and began gathering her gear. If Mick and his crew were planning another move, she wasn't going to sit around waiting for it. By mid-morning, Jessica was parked a short distance from the Iron Horn, her SUV tucked behind a row of overgrown shrubs. She watched the bar through a pair of binoculars, noting the bikes parked out front and the few gang members lingering near the entrance. Mick wasn't there yet, but she recognized Lance, the quiet one from the night before. Jessica's instincts told her Lance wasn't fully on board with Mick's plans. He'd been hesitant, almost reluctant, during the encounter at the motel. If there was a way to de-escalate this situation, Lance might be the key. Jessica stepped out of the SUV, her movements quiet and deliberate, and approached the bar from the side. She waited until Lance was alone, stepping around the corner to intercept him as he leaned against the wall, smoking a cigarette. "Lance," she said, her voice calm but firm. He jumped, startled, dropping his cigarette. His eyes widened as he recognized her. "You? How the hell?" "Relax," Jessica said, raising a hand. "I'm not here to fight." Lance hesitated, his eyes darting toward the bar. "If Mick sees you—" "He won't," Jessica interrupted. "Not if you don't tell him. I'm here to talk." Lance swallowed hard, his nerves obvious. "What do you want?" "To end this," Jessica said simply. "Mick's pride is going to get someone killed. Probably you or one of the others. Is that what you want?" Lance shook his head quickly. "Of course not. But Mick, he's not going to back down. You humiliated him. He's already planning to come after you again." Jessica's expression hardened. "Then help me stop him before he does something he can't take back." Lance hesitated, clearly torn. He glanced back toward the bar, then back at Jessica. "You don't know Mick. He doesn't let things go." Jessica stepped closer, her gaze steady. "And I don't let bullies hurt people without consequences. You've seen what I can do. You know I'm not bluffing." Lance sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want me to do?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint smile. "Let's start by having a little chat." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Jessica knew the game was far from over. Mick was dangerous, but his recklessness made him predictable. The question now was whether Lance would help her or betray her. Either way, she was ready. For Jessica, this wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message. No matter how big the threat, she wasn't backing down. The midday heat bore down on the cracked pavement outside the Iron Horn as Jessica and Lance stood in the shadow of the bar. Lance's face was pale, his uncertainty clear as he shifted from foot to foot, glancing back toward the door every few seconds. "You're asking me to betray Mick," Lance muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica folded her arms, her expression firm but calm. "I'm asking you to stop him from making a mistake that could ruin all of your lives. If he comes for me again, this doesn't end well for any of you." Lance ran a hand through his unkempt hair, glancing nervously at the row of motorcycles lined up near the entrance. "You don't get it. Mick, he's not just my boss. He took me in when I had nothing. He's like family." Jessica's gaze softened slightly. "I get that. But ask yourself, what kind of family drags you into a fight you can't win? What happens when Mick's pride goes too far and someone gets seriously hurt? You've already seen what I'm capable of. Do you think Mick has your back, or does he just want to save face?" Lance didn't answer immediately. His shoulders sagged as he let out a long breath. "So, what's your plan?" Jessica's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "We're going to give Mick what he wants, a showdown, but on my terms." By late afternoon, Lance had slipped back inside the bar, feeding Mick and the others the story Jessica had carefully crafted. "She wants to meet," Lance said, trying to sound reluctant. "Said she's not running. If you've got the guts, she'll be waiting tonight at the old rail yard outside of town." Mick's grin widened, his ego swelling with the thought of finally cornering Jessica on his turf. She finally realized who's in charge. Good. Let's show her what happens when you mess with the Thunder Jackals. The gang cheered, their earlier doubts drowned in the promise of revenge. Mick barked orders, telling his men to gear up and bring everything they had. Tonight would be the night they reclaimed their reputation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Jessica prepared the rail yard for what was to come. The abandoned site, overgrown with weeds and littered with rusting freight cars, provided the perfect setting for what she had in mind. She had positioned herself near the old maintenance shed, a vantage point that gave her a clear view of the yard. With her gear carefully laid out, tactical flashlights, a stun gun, and her pistol, Jessica double-checked every angle, ensuring the field was hers to control. The sound of approaching engines broke the silence, the rumble growing louder as Mick and his crew arrived. Jessica's sharp eyes picked out their figures as they dismounted and began spreading out, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. "All right, lady," Mick called, his voice echoing through the rail yard. "You wanted this, so come out and face me." Jessica didn't answer. She stayed hidden, watching as the bikers moved further into the yard. They were loud, cocky, and uncoordinated, exactly what she had expected. Mick's patience quickly wore thin. "Come on out," he barked. "Or are you scared now?" Still no response. "Spread out," Mick ordered. his frustration mounting. "Find her!" The gang fanned out, their movements sloppy as they searched the shadows. One by one, Jessica picked them off, not with violence, but with precision. The first man turned a corner near the freight cars, only to find himself blinded by a tactical flashlight aimed directly at his eyes. He stumbled back, cursing, before a sharp kick to the back of his knee sent him crumpling to the ground. By the time he regained his senses, Jessica had vanished into the darkness. The second and third fell victim to similar tactics. Disoriented by sudden flashes of light, tripped by carefully placed traps, and left scrambling in confusion. By the time Mick realized his men were dropping like flies, his anger had boiled over into outright fury. "Stop playing games!" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the metal walls of the freight cars. Jessica finally stepped into view, her calm figure illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. She stood on top of one of the freight cars, looking down at Mick with an air of authority that sent a chill through his spine. "You wanted a fight," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Here I am." Mick raised his bat, his grip tightening. "You think you can take me?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint smirk. "I think you already know the answer to that." With a roar, Mick charged, his bat raised high. Jessica leapt down from the freight car, her movements fluid and precise. She sidestepped his swing easily, delivering a sharp elbow to his ribs that made him stumble. Mick recovered quickly, swinging again, but Jessica ducked under the blow, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The bat clattered to the ground as Mick cried out in pain. "You don't listen, do you?" Jessica said coldly, twisting his arm further until he dropped to his knees. Behind them, the remaining bikers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Lance stepped forward, his face torn with conflict. "Mick, it's over!" Lance shouted. Mick glared at him, his pride refusing to admit defeat. "No, she doesn't get to win." Jessica released Mick's arm, shoving him back with a force that sent him sprawling. She stepped back, her gaze shifting to the rest of the gang. "This is your leader?" she asked, her voice sharp. "A man who drags you into fights you can't win, just to feed his ego." The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. "I've faced men like him before," Jessica continued. "They don't care about you. They care about control, about looking strong, even if it means dragging everyone down with them." Lance looked at Mick, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he saw the truth in Jessica's words. Mick wasn't looking out for them. He was using them. "Mick," Lance said quietly, stepping back, "I'm done." The others hesitated, then followed Lance's lead, dropping their weapons and stepping away from Mick. Mick's eyes blazed with fury. "You cowards!" he shouted. "You're all useless!" Jessica stepped closer to him, her voice low. "It's over, Mick. Walk away." For a moment, Mick seemed ready to lunge at her again, but the sound of distant sirens froze him in place. The gang's earlier chaos had drawn attention, and the police were on their way. Jessica stepped back, watching as Mick scrambled to his feet, his fury turning to desperation. "This isn't over," he spat, before turning and running toward his bike. The gang watched him go, their faces filled with a mix of relief and shame. Lance turned to Jessica, his expression serious. "What now?" he asked. Jessica regarded him for a moment, then said, "That's up to you. You don't have to follow him anymore. You're better than this." Lance nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. As the sirens grew louder, Jessica turned and disappeared into the shadows of the rail yard. For Mick, the fight was far from over. But for Lance and the others, it was the beginning of a chance to break free from the cycle of violence. Jessica Kane had sent her message loud and clear. The days of unchecked arrogance were over, and she wasn't done yet. The faint glow of dawn crept across the horizon, bathing the rail yard in muted gold as the police cars finally rolled in. Officers stepped cautiously through the scene, finding the battered gang members who had stayed behind, some nursing bruises, others staring blankly at the ground. The tension in the air was palpable as questions were asked and half-hearted answers were mumbled. Lance sat near one of the rusted freight cars, his shoulders slumped, a heavy weight in his chest. Jessica's words still echoed in his mind. You don't have to follow him anymore. He knew she was right. Mick had always been about power and control, never about loyalty. Lance had seen it before. In the small ways Mick sacrificed his men's safety for his own pride. But it had taken Jessica, a stranger, to finally make him see it clearly. An officer approached him. You one of them? Lance looked up, his expression resigned. Not anymore. The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't press. You'd better come with us. Lance didn't resist as the officer guided him toward the patrol cars. He knew he had choices to make, and staying silent wasn't one of them anymore. Jessica watched from a distance as the police rounded up the bikers who hadn't fled with Mick. She stayed hidden among the shadows of the rail yard, her sharp eyes scanning the scene for any sign of Mick himself. But he was long gone, his retreating motorcycle a bitter reminder that the real threat had slipped through her fingers. She adjusted her jacket and made her way back to her SUV, which was parked just beyond the outskirts of the rail yard. Her phone buzzed as she reached for the door. It was a text from her contact. Good work. Cops cleaned up. Need anything else? Jessica typed a quick reply. Mick's still out there. Dig deeper. I want his entire operation. As she started the engine, her mind raced. Mick wouldn't take this loss quietly. Men like him never did. If anything, his humiliation would push him to escalate, and that made him even more dangerous. Mick paced furiously inside an old garage hidden deep in the woods outside of town. His makeshift hideout was filled with rusted tools, beer cans, and the acrid smell of gasoline. He had abandoned the rest of his crew, the ones who hadn't already turned on him, and was now surrounded by a handful of his most loyal and most desperate men. Pete, a wiry man with a nervous energy, spoke hesitantly. Mick, maybe we should let this go. She's not just some diner lady. She's trained, man. We don't know what she's capable of. Mick rounded on him, his eyes blazing. What she's capable of? What about us, huh? Are we just going to roll over and let her win? She humiliated us, humiliated me. Pete flinched, but didn't respond. The other men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Mick slammed his fist onto a workbench, scattering a pile of tools. No, this isn't over. We're not just going to sit here and lick our wounds. We're going to hit her back. Hard. How? Another man asked cautiously. Mick's face twisted into a dangerous grin. We find out where she is. We find out who she cares about. And we make her regret ever crossing us. Back at the motel, Jessica sat at the small desk in her room, scrolling through the data her contact had sent over. Mick's operation was more extensive than she'd originally thought. While his gang wasn't large, they were tied to several petty crime rings in the area, illegal gambling, stolen goods, and even a few links to arms trafficking. Her fingers hovered over her phone as she considered her options. Mick was dangerous, but he wasn't untouchable. She could go straight to the authorities with the information she had, but that wouldn't stop him from retaliating. She needed to neutralize the threat entirely, and that meant cutting off his resources and support. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jessica tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath the desk. She approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. It was Lance. She opened the door a crack, her expression guarded. What do you want? Lance held up his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm not here to fight. I need to talk. Jessica studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. Lance entered slowly, his posture tense but non-threatening. I told the cops everything, he said, his voice low. About Mick, about the gang, about everything we've done. Jessica leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And they're going to come after him, Lance continued. But I don't think it'll be enough. Mick's not just going to sit around and wait to get caught. He's already talking about going after you. Jessica's jaw tightened. She had expected as much. Lance hesitated before speaking again. I want to help. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Why the sudden change of heart? Lance's shoulders slumped slightly. Because you're right. Mick doesn't care about us. He never did. And if he's not stopped, more people are going to get hurt. Jessica studied him carefully. searching for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was a man who had finally reached his breaking point. "All right," she said after a moment. "You want to help? Then tell me everything you know about where Mick might be hiding." By late afternoon, Jessica and Lance were on the move, driving toward an old industrial park that Lance had mentioned as one of Mick's fallback spots. The drive was tense, the silence between them broken only by Lance's occasional directions. "You really think we can stop him?" Lance asked finally, his voice uncertain. Jessica kept her eyes on the road. "We're not stopping him. We're making sure he can't hurt anyone else again." As they pulled into the industrial park, Jessica parked the SUV behind a row of crumbling buildings. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of wind and the distant hum of traffic. Lance pointed toward a large warehouse at the far end of the lot. "If he's here, that's where he'll be." Jessica nodded, her mind already mapping out the approach. "Stay here," she said firmly. "If things go south, I don't need you in the crossfire." "But no arguments," Jessica said, cutting him off. "Stay." Lance reluctantly nodded, watching as Jessica disappeared into the shadows. The warehouse was dimly lit, its interior a maze of rusting machinery and stacked crates. Jessica moved silently, her steps calculated and her senses sharp. She heard voices before she saw them, Mick's unmistakable growl, followed by the nervous murmurs of his remaining crew. "She's dead the next time I see her," Mick snarled. "I don't care what it takes." Jessica stepped into view, her voice cutting through the space like a blade. "You won't get that chance." Mick spun around, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "You've got guts, lady, I'll give you that, but this time you're outnumbered." Jessica's gaze swept over the room. There were 4 men with Mick, all armed, but their stances betrayed their nervousness. "I don't need numbers," Jessica said calmly. "I just need you to know one thing. This ends here." Mick laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. Big words for someone who's about to lose. Jessica didn't respond. She moved. The fight was brutal and swift, her training evident in every calculated strike. She disarmed the first man with ease, using his own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of crates. The second lunged at her with a crowbar, but she ducked under the swing, landing a precise blow to his jaw. Mick watched, his confidence fading as his men fell one by one. Finally, it was just the 2 of them. "You should have stayed out of this," Mick growled, pulling a knife from his belt. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "So should you." The final clash was short but decisive. Jessica's movements were fluid and controlled, her experience overwhelming Mick's brute strength. Within moments, he was disarmed and on the ground, gasping for breath. Jessica stood over him, her voice cold. "It's over." As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Mick's defiance crumbled. For the first time he realized he'd lost, and Jessica knew the fight, for now, was done. The faint glow of dawn crept across the horizon, bathing the rail yard in muted gold as the police cars finally rolled in. Officers stepped cautiously through the scene, finding the battered gang members who had stayed behind, some nursing bruises, others staring blankly at the ground. The tension in the air was palpable as questions were asked and half-hearted answers were mumbled. Lance sat near one of the rusted freight cars, his shoulders slumped, a heavy weight in his chest. Jessica's words still echoed in his mind. "You don't have to follow him anymore." He knew she was right. Mick had always been about power and control, never about loyalty. Lance had seen it before. In the small ways Mick sacrificed his men's safety for his own pride. But it had taken Jessica, a stranger, to finally make him see it clearly. An officer approached him. "You one of them?" Lance looked up, his expression resigned. "Not anymore." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "You'd better come with us." Lance didn't resist as the officer guided him toward the patrol cars. He knew he had choices to make, and staying silent wasn't one of them anymore. Jessica watched from a distance as the police rounded up the bikers who hadn't fled with Mick. She stayed hidden among the shadows of the rail yard, her sharp eyes scanning the scene for any sign of Mick himself. But he was long gone, his retreating motorcycle a bitter reminder that the real threat had slipped through her fingers. She adjusted her jacket and made her way back to her SUV, which was parked just beyond the outskirts of the rail yard. Her phone buzzed as she reached for the door. It was a text from her contact. "Good work. Cops cleaned up. Need anything else?" Jessica typed a quick reply. "Mick's still out there. Dig deeper. I want his entire operation." As she started the engine, her mind raced. Mick wouldn't take this loss quietly. Men like him never did. If anything, his humiliation would push him to escalate, and that made him even more dangerous. Mick paced furiously inside an old garage hidden deep in the woods outside of town. His makeshift hideout was filled with rusted tools, beer cans, and the acrid smell of gasoline. He had abandoned the rest of his crew, the ones who hadn't already turned on him, and was now surrounded by a handful of his most loyal and most desperate men. Pete, a wiry man with a nervous energy, spoke hesitantly. "Mick, maybe we should let this go. She's not just some diner lady. She's trained, man. We don't know what she's capable of." Mick rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "What she's capable of? What about us, huh? Are we just going to roll over and let her win? She humiliated us, humiliated me." Pete flinched but didn't respond. The other men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Mick slammed his fist onto a workbench, scattering a pile of tools. "No, this isn't over. We're not just going to sit here and lick our wounds. We're going to hit her back. Hard." "How?" another man asked cautiously. Mick's face twisted into a dangerous grin. "We find out where she is. We find out who she cares about, and we make her regret ever crossing us." Back at the motel, Jessica sat at the small desk in her room, scrolling through the data her contact had sent over. Mick's operation was more extensive than she'd originally thought. While his gang wasn't large, they were tied to several petty crime rings in the area: illegal gambling, stolen goods, and even a few links to arms trafficking. Her fingers hovered over her phone as she considered her options. Mick was dangerous, but he wasn't untouchable. She could go straight to the authorities with the information she had, but that wouldn't stop him from retaliating. She needed to neutralize the threat entirely, and that meant cutting off his resources and support. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jessica tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath the desk. She approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. It was Lance. She opened the door a crack, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Lance held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight. I need to talk." Jessica studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. Lance entered slowly, his posture tense but non-threatening. "I told the cops everything," he said, his voice low. "About Mick, about the gang, about everything we've done." Jessica leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And they're going to come after him," Lance continued. "But I don't think it'll be enough. Mick's not just going to sit around and wait to get caught. He's already talking about going after you." Jessica's jaw tightened. She had expected as much. Lance hesitated before speaking again. "I want to help." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Lance's shoulders slumped slightly. "Because you're right. Mick doesn't care about us. He never did. And if he's not stopped, more people are going to get hurt." Jessica studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was a man who had finally reached his breaking point. "All right," she said after a moment. "You want to help? Then tell me everything you know about where Mick might be hiding." By late afternoon, Jessica and Lance were on the move, driving toward an old industrial park that Lance had mentioned as one of Mick's fallback spots. The drive was tense, the silence between them broken only by Lance's occasional directions. "You really think we can stop him?" Lance asked finally, his voice uncertain. Jessica kept her eyes on the road. "We're not stopping him. We're making sure he can't hurt anyone else again." As they pulled into the industrial park, Jessica parked the SUV behind a row of crumbling buildings. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of wind and the distant hum of traffic. Lance pointed toward a large warehouse at the far end of the lot. "If he's here, that's where he'll be. Jessica nodded, her mind already mapping out the approach. "Stay here," she said firmly. "If things go south, I don't need you in the crossfire." "But—" "No arguments," Jessica said, cutting him off. "Stay." Lance reluctantly nodded, watching as Jessica disappeared into the shadows. The warehouse was dimly lit, its interior a maze of rusting machinery and stacked crates. Jessica moved silently, her steps calculated and her senses sharp. She heard voices before she saw them, Mick's unmistakable growl, followed by the nervous murmurs of his remaining crew. "She's dead the next time I see her," Mick snarled. "I don't care what it takes." Jessica stepped into view, her voice cutting through the space like a blade. "You won't get that chance." Mick spun around, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "You've got guts, lady, I'll give you that, but this time you're outnumbered." Jessica's gaze swept over the room. There were 4 men with Mick, all armed, but their stances betrayed their nervousness. "I don't need numbers," Jessica said calmly. "I just need you to know one thing. This ends here." Mick laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Big words for someone who's about to lose." Jessica didn't respond. She moved. The fight was brutal and swift, her training evident in every calculated strike. She disarmed the first man with ease, using his own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of crates. The second lunged at her with a crowbar, but she ducked under the swing, landing a precise blow to his jaw. Mick watched, his confidence fading as his men fell one by one. Finally, it was just the 2 of them. "You should have stayed out of this," Mick growled, pulling a knife from his belt. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "So should you." The final clash was short but decisive. Jessica's movements were fluid and controlled, her experience overwhelming Mick's brute strength. Within moments he was disarmed and on the ground, gasping for breath. Jessica stood over him, her voice cold. "It's over." As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Mick's defiance crumbled. For the first time he realized he'd lost, and Jessica knew the fight, for now, was done. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the tension-filled silence in the warehouse. Jessica stood over Mick, her breath steady despite the fight she'd just endured. Her calm demeanor only made his humiliation sting more. You think you've won?" Mick spat, struggling to sit up. His voice was weak, but the venom in his words was unmistakable. "This isn't over. I've got people, connections. You don't scare me." Jessica crouched down to his level, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "You're right. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to stop you, and when they drag you away in cuffs, you'll finally realize something. Your connections can't save you from your own arrogance." Mick's defiant glare faltered as the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Jessica straightened, stepping back just as the warehouse doors burst open, floodlights from police cars illuminating the scene. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them!" Jessica raised her hands slowly, stepping aside to allow the officers to take control. Mick's gang, or what was left of it, didn't resist as they were cuffed and hauled out one by one. Mick himself struggled weakly, shouting curses until an officer silenced him with a warning. Officer Maria Lopez, a seasoned cop with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, approached Jessica, her hand resting on the radio clipped to her shoulder. "Well," Lopez said, surveying the scene, "looks like you had quite the party." Jessica lowered her hands, her expression neutral. It was a necessary cleanup. Lopez's brow arched, but her tone remained professional. "We've been tracking this gang for months. Never thought they'd go down like this. Care to explain how you're involved?" Jessica hesitated for a moment, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded card. She handed it to Lopez. "Former Force Recon," Lopez read aloud, her voice tinged with surprise. "That explains a lot." "They targeted me," Jessica said simply. "I made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else." Lopez studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're lucky we don't charge people for doing our job." Jessica gave a faint smile. "Just trying to help." Lopez tucked the card into her pocket. "Well, you've made a lot of people in this town safer, but this isn't how we usually handle things. Don't make a habit of it." Jessica nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. As the officers escorted Mick and his crew out, Lance emerged from the shadows near the warehouse entrance. He walked slowly toward Jessica, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You all right?" he asked hesitantly. Jessica nodded. "I'm fine. What about you?" Lance shrugged, glancing toward Mick as he was shoved into the back of a patrol car. "Feels weird, seeing him like that. For a long time, he was everything to the guys. Now, he's just another criminal going to jail." "He was always just another criminal," Jessica said bluntly. "You just didn't see it." Lance winced at the truth of her words, but didn't argue. "What are you going to do now?" Jessica asked after a moment. Lance looked at her, his expression a mix of uncertainty and determination. "Start over, I guess. Maybe get out of town, find something better to do with my life." Jessica's gaze softened. "That's a good choice. You've got a chance to change things. Don't waste it." Lance nodded, a small flicker of hope crossing his face. "Thanks for everything." Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the glow of the police lights. The Riverside Diner was buzzing with activity, a stark contrast to the tense silence of a few days ago. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, how Mick Sanders and his gang had been taken down, and how a mysterious woman had been at the center of it all. Jessica sat in her usual booth, sipping her coffee as the waitress approached, a broad smile on her face. "You're the talk of the town," the waitress said, setting down a fresh plate of toast. "Everyone's saying you're some kind of hero." Jessica shook her head with a faint smile. "Just did what needed to be done." "Well, whatever you did, it worked. People feel safer now. I even heard the sheriff's department is cracking down on the smaller gangs because of this." Jessica glanced out the window, her thoughts already moving to the next step. She wasn't one for the spotlight, but if her actions had sparked real change, then it had all been worth it. The bell above the door jingled, and Officer Lopez walked in, her uniform crisp and her expression sharp. She spotted Jessica immediately and made her way over. "Mind if I join you?" Lopez asked. Jessica gestured to the seat across from her. Lopez sat down, folding her hands on the table. "I thought you'd skip town by now." Jessica sipped her coffee. "Not yet. Wanted to make sure everything settled down first." Lopez nodded, her tone turning serious. "We've got Mick in custody, and with the evidence we've collected, he's not getting out anytime soon. But I get the feeling this isn't the last time we'll see trouble like this." "It never is," Jessica said evenly. Lopez leaned back, studying her. "You're good at what you do, Kane. Too good to just be passing through diners and taking down gangs on your own." Jessica met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I don't work for anyone anymore." "Maybe you should," Lopez said, her tone pointed. "People like you can make a real difference, more than what you did here." Jessica didn't respond immediately. Instead, she finished her coffee, set the cup down, and gave Lopez a small smile. "I'll think about it." Lopez nodded, standing up. "You do that, and if you ever need a way back in, give me a call." She handed Jessica her card and left the diner, the bell jingling softly behind her. Jessica stood on the balcony of her motel room, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Her phone buzzed with a new message from her contact. "Mick's network is officially dismantled. Local cops are cleaning up the rest. Good work." Jessica exhaled, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The job was done, at least for now. But as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that her fight wasn't over. The world was full of men like Mick Sanders, bullies who thrived on fear and control. And while Jessica had left the battlefield behind years ago, the battles had a way of finding her. As she packed her bag and prepared to leave town, Jessica glanced at the card Officer Lopez had given her. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, a small reminder that no matter where she went, there was always work to be done, and Jessica Kane was always ready. The engine of Jessica's SUV hummed softly as she drove along the stretch of highway, the small town of Riverside disappearing in her rearview mirror. The events of the past few days played through her mind, the bikers, the takedown, and the unexpected alliances she had formed. Though she was leaving Riverside behind, she knew her story there wasn't entirely over. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling her out of her thoughts. Jessica glanced at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, but her instincts told her it wasn't a random call. She pulled over to the side of the road, picking up the phone cautiously. "This is Kane," she answered. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative, and familiar. "Jessica Kane, former Force Recon Marine. I've been following your work in Riverside." Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. "Who's this?" "Let's just say I'm someone who admires results. And you've delivered." Jessica didn't respond, waiting for the stranger to get to the point. "I represent a group that handles complicated problems that traditional law enforcement can't or won't solve. Your background and recent actions make you an ideal candidate for what we do." Jessica's voice hardened. "I'm not looking for a job." "That's what you said when you left the Marines," the voice replied smoothly. "But here you are, taking down gangs and protecting small towns. You're not the kind to sit still, Kane, and we both know it." Jessica's jaw tightened. He wasn't wrong. "What's the job?" she asked after a moment, her tone guarded. "A growing criminal network tied to human trafficking. We've been tracking them for months, but they're slippery, dangerous. We need someone on the ground who can get close, disrupt their operations, and pave the way for enforcement to take them out for good." Jessica's mind raced. Human trafficking wasn't something she could ignore. Still, she wasn't about to jump into something blind. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're effective," the voice said simply. "And because someone like you is exactly what they'd never see coming. Think about it. I'll send the details." The line went dead before Jessica could respond. Jessica sat in her SUV for several minutes, staring at the phone in her hand. She wasn't surprised when a text message came through moments later containing a file with the details of the operation. She opened it, her eyes scanning the names, locations, and faces tied to the network. It was worse than she thought. Smuggling routes, front businesses, even connections to corrupt officials. This wasn't just a local gang. It was a well-organized, multi-state operation with deep pockets and a ruthless reputation. Her stomach churned at the sight of photos showing terrified victims, their faces blurred, but their fear unmistakable. This was the kind of evil she had enlisted in the Marines to fight. Jessica exhaled slowly, her decision already made. She couldn't turn her back on this. The first step was intel. Jessica drove to a nearby city where one of the network's smaller fronts operated, a grimy nightclub on the outskirts of town. She spent the next few nights observing the club from a distance, noting the patterns of the bouncers, the comings and goings of certain patrons, and the subtle signs of illegal activity. The file she'd been given included the name of a low-level enforcer named Rico Alvarez. He wasn't a major player, but he had access to the bigger fish. Jessica's plan was simple: get close to Rico, gain his trust, and use him to climb the ladder. On the fourth night, Jessica made her move. Dressed in a fitted leather jacket and boots, she approached the nightclub with the confidence of someone who belonged. The bouncers gave her a once-over, but didn't stop her as she slipped inside. The club was dark and loud, the pounding bass vibrating through the floor. Jessica moved through the crowd with ease, her sharp eyes scanning the room until she spotted Rico in a corner booth, flanked by two associates. He was laughing loudly, a cigar in one hand and a drink in the other. Jessica approached the bar, ordering a drink but keeping her attention on Rico. She waited until one of his associates got up, leaving a space open at the booth. With her drink in hand, she sauntered over, catching Rico's eye. "You don't look like the kind of guy who drinks alone," she said with a sly smile. Rico looked her over, his curiosity piqued. "And you don't look like the kind of girl who needs company." "Maybe not," Jessica replied, sliding into the open seat. "But I was curious about you." Rico grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. "Well, curiosity's a dangerous thing, sweetheart, but I like your style." Jessica spent the next hour playing her part perfectly. Charming, confident, and just mysterious enough to keep Rico intrigued. By the end of the night, she had learned enough about his operation to know she was on the right track. Over the next few weeks, Jessica worked her way deeper into Rico's circle. She carefully balanced gaining his trust while keeping her cover intact, always staying one step ahead. Her military training came in handy, reading people, adapting to unexpected situations, and maintaining her composure under pressure. But as she climbed higher, the stakes grew deadlier. Rico's boss, a ruthless trafficker named Victor DeLuca, was known for his paranoia and his tendency to eliminate anyone he suspected of betrayal. Jessica knew it was only a matter of time before she attracted his attention. One night, as she sat in a private room with Rico and several other members of the network, her phone buzzed with a message from her contact. "DeLuca's aware of a leak. Be careful." Jessica's blood ran cold. She glanced at Rico, who was laughing at a crude joke one of his men had made. Did he suspect her? Or was DeLuca targeting someone else? Either way, she needed to act fast. The next night, Jessica was called to a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location that immediately set off alarms in her mind. She arrived prepared, concealing a small knife and a backup communication device in her boots. Inside the warehouse, Victor DeLuca waited, flanked by armed guards. His sharp eyes studied Jessica as she entered, his expression cold and unreadable. "Miss Kane," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "I've been hearing things about you." Jessica kept her composure, her voice steady. "Good things, I hope." DeLuca's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's find out." The tension in the room was suffocating as DeLuca gestured for one of his men to step forward. He carried a file, one that Jessica recognized instantly. It was her military record, detailed and damning. "I don't like surprises," DeLuca said, his gaze narrowing. "And you, my dear, are full of them." Jessica's mind raced, but her voice remained calm. "And yet, here I am. If I were a threat, don't you think I'd have done something by now?" DeLuca tilted his head, considering her words. "Perhaps. Or maybe you're just waiting for the right moment." Jessica took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "If you don't trust me, then kill me. But if you do, I can give you something no one else can. Access to networks you haven't even dreamed of." DeLuca's eyes narrowed, his curiosity evident. "You'd better hope you're telling the truth." As Jessica walked out of the warehouse alive, she knew the clock was ticking. The deeper she went, the harder it would be to escape. But she wasn't just there to survive. She was there to dismantle DeLuca's empire from the inside out, and she wasn't leaving until the job was done. Jessica Kane's infiltration of Victor DeLuca's trafficking network was one of precision, grit, and sheer determination. As she climbed deeper into the organization, she gathered critical evidence, risking her life to expose the criminals at the top. Her strategy culminated in a daring operation where she coordinated with law enforcement to stage a massive raid, leading to DeLuca's arrest and the rescue of dozens of victims. For Jessica, the mission wasn't just about taking down a powerful criminal. It was about standing up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her actions inspired a ripple effect, sparking greater awareness and stronger crackdowns on trafficking operations across the region. But Jessica didn't stick around for recognition. As the dust settled, she quietly disappeared, ready to take on the next challenge, knowing there would always be another battle to fight. Her story wasn't just a testament to bravery, it was a reminder that one person, driven by purpose, can make an extraordinary difference. Jessica's story shows us that courage and determination can lead to extraordinary change. Her fight against injustice reminds us that there are heroes among us, sometimes in the most unexpected places. If you were inspired by her story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of bravery and resilience. Want to support real-life heroes like Jessica? Consider donating to organizations that fight human trafficking and support veterans transitioning to civilian life. Links are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and remember, every small act of courage can lead to something extraordinary. Stay tuned for our next story.
A biker gang messes with the wrong man when they invade a quiet wilderness cabin. Inside is a soldier who's trained, ready, and won't back down. Their threats turn into chaos as he fights back with skill and precision. What happens next is a showdown they never saw coming, and you won't believe the ending. The first light of dawn stretched over the jagged mountain peaks, casting a soft glow across the dense pine forest. In the clearing, Luke Anderson stood by his cabin, splitting logs with steady, practiced swings. The cool morning air was still, and his sharp eyes swept the horizon, ever watchful, though weeks had passed without a single visitor. For Luke, the quiet of solitude wasn't a burden, it was his peace, the tranquility shattered with the roar of motorcycle engines. Luke straightened, his grip tightening on the axe. Through the trees, a convoy of bikes tore down the dirt road, their headlights piercing the encroaching dusk. One of the bikers, massive, with a leather vest and a smug grin, peeled off and rode straight toward Luke's cabin. He skidded to a stop a few yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Nice place, old man," the biker sneered. "Perfect for someone who don't want to be found." Luke said nothing, his piercing gaze locked on the intruder. The biker smirked, revving his engine. "Lighten up," the biker shouted over the din. "We're just passing through unless, of course, you feel like entertaining us." The other bikers hooted in laughter, watching from a distance. Luke stepped forward, calm but deliberate. His voice, steady as stone, cut through the noise. "Turn around, leave." The biker's grin faltered. He revved the engine once more, but Luke didn't flinch. The tension was palpable, like the moments before a thunderstorm. "Come on, Brick," one of the bikers called. "Let's go. This guy's no fun." Brick hesitated, his bravado waning under Luke's unwavering stare. He spat on the ground, flipped the bird, and roared back toward his gang. Luke stood motionless, watching until the bikers disappeared down the road. He exhaled slowly, his grip on the axe loosening, but his instincts told him this wasn't over. It was never over. Inside the cabin, Luke began locking doors, setting hidden tripwires, and loading his weapons. His peaceful existence had just been disturbed, and Luke Anderson had learned long ago that peace always came at a price. The morning sun filtered through the pines, casting long beams of light onto the forest floor. Luke sat on his porch, sipping coffee from a tin mug. His eyes scanned the tree line with the same calculated intensity he'd once used to assess enemy strongholds. The signs were subtle. A broken branch here, faint tire tracks there. The bikers had returned during the night. They hadn't confronted him directly, but their message was clear. A crude skull and crossbones had been spray-painted on a tree near the edge of his property. Luke's jaw tightened. He set the mug down on the wooden railing, its faint clink swallowed by the wilderness silence. With deliberate steps, he walked toward the tree, studying the graffiti. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a threat, a challenge. A soft rustle came from behind him. Luke turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife strapped to his belt. A young woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands raised defensively. "Whoa, sorry," she said quickly. "Didn't mean to startle you." Luke relaxed slightly but didn't drop his guard. The woman was in her late 20s, with a hiking pack slung over her shoulder and a wary look in her eyes. She looked out of place here, like someone who'd lost their way. "You shouldn't be here," Luke said flatly. "I know," she replied, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I got turned around on the trails, saw your cabin and thought I'd ask for directions. Didn't mean to intrude." Luke's eyes narrowed. She seemed genuine, but the timing was suspicious. He pointed toward the main dirt road. "Follow that for about 2 miles. It'll take you back to the main trailhead." She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the spray-painted tree. "That yours?" "No," Luke said curtly. The woman frowned, her brow furrowing as she stepped closer. "Are you okay? I mean, that looks like something someone left to intimidate you." Luke's lips thinned. He didn't like explaining himself to strangers. "I can handle it." She nodded slowly, sensing his reluctance to talk. "Okay, well, thanks for the directions. Name's Mara, by the way. Luke didn't respond, his piercing gaze returning to the tree line. Taking the hint, Mara turned and headed back toward the trail, but she glanced over her shoulder, her concern evident. The bikers returned at dusk. The low rumble of engines echoed through the forest as Luke sat sharpening his hunting knife. He didn't move as the convoy pulled into the clearing, their headlights cutting through the twilight. Brick led the group, his swagger amplified by the rowdy laughter of his crew. "Well, look who's still playing house in the middle of nowhere," Brick called out, dismounting his bike. His boots crunched on the gravel as he sauntered closer. "You didn't like our little present last night?" Luke set the knife down on the porch rail and stood, his movements calm but deliberate. He faced Brick, his towering frame still as a statue. "You made your point," Luke said quietly. "Now leave." Brick laughed, a deep, grating sound. "See? That's the problem with guys like you. You think you can just tell us what to do." He gestured to his crew, who were already spreading out, their rough voices mixing with the hum of idling bikes. Luke's eyes tracked them carefully. He noted their positions, their weapons, knives, chains, a few bats. His military mind automatically calculated angles, distances, vulnerabilities. Brick stepped closer, his smirk widening. "You live out here all alone, right? No one to call for help? No one to hear you scream?" "You don't know me," Luke said, his voice low and steady. "No, but I know your type," Brick shot back. "Old-timers who think they can live off the grid, like the world owes them something. Let me tell you, Grandpa, this forest ain't big enough for you and us." The insult didn't register with Luke. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of authority. "You're right about one thing. No one's coming to help you out here." Brick blinked, his bravado faltering for just a second. He recovered quickly, turning to his gang. "You hear that? Old man thinks he's tough." The laughter swelled, but it didn't faze Luke. He stood firm, his calm unnerving. Brick's grin faded. He stepped closer, now just inches from Luke. "You don't scare me." Luke leaned in slightly, his voice barely audible. "You should be." Brick flinched, but before he could respond, Luke turned and walked back to his cabin. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving the bikers standing in stunned silence. Inside, Luke picked up his knife and resumed sharpening it. His heart rate remained steady, his focus absolute. He had spent decades preparing for moments like these, and he wasn't about to be caught off guard. Outside, the roar of engines faded as the bikers retreated into the night, but Luke knew they'd be back. They always came back. That night, Luke worked quietly, fortifying his cabin and preparing for the inevitable. He set traps along the perimeter, each one designed to slow intruders without causing unnecessary harm, at least not yet. By the time he finally rested, the moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest. Luke sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. His instincts told him the bikers wouldn't wait long to make their next move, and when they did, they'd learn that some battles aren't worth starting. Morning broke over the forest in a wash of gold and orange, but for Luke, sleep had been elusive. He spent the night at his perch by the cabin window, his sharp eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The silence had held, but that only meant the bikers were plotting something more brazen. Stepping outside, he surveyed the damage left by their late-night vandalism. Deep gouges from motorcycle tires scarred his once pristine clearing. The crude graffiti on trees and his cabin wall was meant to provoke. Near the front steps, a shattered whiskey bottle glinted in the early sunlight, its contents staining the earth. Luke stood still for a long moment, breathing in the cool air. This wasn't about a random act of intimidation anymore. It was personal, a test to see how far he could be pushed. The faint snap of a twig drew his attention. Instinctively, he dropped low, his body blending with the landscape as he scanned the woods. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a flash of movement, a figure retreating into the trees. Luke's jaw tightened. They were watching. Inside the cabin, Luke opened a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. The gear he pulled out was a stark contrast to the modest, off-the-grid life he appeared to live. A tactical vest, a set of knives, a compact communications device, and his trusted Sig Sauer P320, its matte black finish as sharp as the man wielding it. He strapped on the vest and holstered the sidearm. The knives found their place on his belt, each one positioned for quick access. Then he grabbed a map from the wall, unrolled it on the table, and marked potential vantage points and ambush locations around his property. If the bikers wanted to play games, they were about to learn the rules were far beyond their comprehension. The next assault came at noon. Luke was in the clearing, repairing the outer wall of the cabin, when the low growl of engines rose in the distance. This time, they weren't bothering with subtlety. The sound grew louder, closer, until the first bike tore into view, followed by 5 more. Luke straightened, his hammer hanging loosely in one hand as Brick dismounted, his cronies following suit. They carried bats and chains, the confidence of men who'd never faced true danger. Brick grinned, his teeth yellow in the sunlight. "Look who's out here playing house again," he jeered. "You think we're just going to stop because you gave us the old Clint Eastwood glare?" Luke said nothing. He set the hammer down with deliberate calm and folded his arms, his cold gaze locked on Brick. The gang leader took a step forward, swinging his bat lazily. "We don't like being ignored, old man. Time to pay attention." Brick raised the bat, ready to swing, but Luke was faster. With a single fluid motion, he stepped forward, grabbed the bat mid-swing, and wrenched it from Brick's grip. The move was so sudden, so precise that the other bikers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Brick staggered back, stunned. Before he could react, Luke flipped the bat, planting its end into the ground. "Leave," Luke said, his voice a low growl. "Now." For a brief moment, Brick seemed to waver, his confidence shaken, but his cronies rallied, stepping forward with snarls and raised weapons. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, lunged at Luke with a chain. Luke sidestepped, his hands moving like lightning. In a blur of motion, the chain was torn from the man's grasp, coiled expertly around his wrist, and yanked hard enough to send him sprawling. Luke didn't wait for him to recover. He turned toward the others, his stance calm, his eyes cold. "You've made your point," Luke said, his tone steady but carrying an edge of menace. "Don't push further." Brick's face darkened. He motioned for the others to back off, his jaw clenched tight with barely contained rage. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice trembling with humiliation. Luke didn't respond. He stood like a stone sentinel, watching as the gang mounted their bikes and roared away. But he knew the battle was far from done. That evening, Luke moved swiftly through the forest, laying out the groundwork for the next encounter. His traps were subtle but effective. Wire snares designed to trip, hidden pits to disorient, and carefully placed logs rigged to swing down at chest level. Every step was calculated, every placement deliberate. Flashbacks of his military days flickered in his mind as he worked. Ambushes in the desert, insurgents in the mountains, the sharp crack of gunfire in the dead of night. He had been a master of defense and offense then, and those instincts were as sharp as ever. As darkness fell, Luke retreated to the cabin, locking the doors and checking his rifle. He sat by the window again, his senses heightened. The forest was silent now, but he knew it was the calm before the storm. At midnight, a faint sound reached Luke's ears, the crunch of boots on gravel. He stood slowly, his movement silent as a shadow. Peering through the window, he saw dark figures moving through the clearing, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight. The bikers were back, and this time they were coming for blood. Luke adjusted his grip on the rifle, his pulse steady. As the first man crossed the boundary into the traps he'd set, Luke's lips curled into a grim smile. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The night stretched long and heavy as Luke waited for the bikers to cross into the maze he had prepared. From his vantage point inside the cabin, he watched the dark shapes move cautiously through the clearing. This wasn't their usual approach. There was no roaring bravado, no loud taunts. They were hunting now, weapons ready, their movements deliberate. Luke's finger hovered over the safety on his rifle, his heartbeat steady. This wasn't fear. It was focus. Years of training and combat had honed him into a predator, and these men were walking straight into his territory. The first trap sprung with a sharp snap. A man cried out as a wire snare tightened around his ankle, yanking him off his feet. The others froze, startled by the sudden sound. "What the hell was that?" one of them hissed. "Shut up and keep moving," another barked. "It's just a trap. The old man's playing games." Luke watched as they approached the second trap, a shallow pit concealed by leaves. The lead biker stepped on the cover, and it gave way beneath him. He let out a startled yell as he tumbled in, landing hard on the packed earth below. The group scrambled to help him, their formation breaking. Luke allowed himself a grim smile. He'd learned long ago that chaos was his ally. Luke moved silently through the shadows outside the cabin, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He closed the distance between himself and the bikers, circling them like a wolf stalking its prey. The men were tense now, their earlier confidence shattered. "Brick, this ain't worth it," one of them muttered, his voice trembling. "Let's just get out of here." Brick's face twisted in anger. "Shut your mouth. We're not leaving until this old bastard knows who he's dealing with." Luke's voice cut through the night, calm and chilling. "I already know who you are." The bikers whipped around, weapons raised, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You're just loud boys in a quiet forest," Luke continued, his tone unshaken. "You don't belong here." "Show yourself," Brick roared, spinning in place, his eyes wild. Luke didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, a shadow among shadows. He reached the man at the rear of the group and struck, pulling him into the darkness with a quick, calculated motion. The biker let out a muffled cry before falling silent. The others froze. "Tank?" one of them whispered. "Where's Tank?" Brick gritted his teeth. "Stay together, don't let him pick us off." But it was already too late. Luke had the upper hand, and the bikers were playing his game now. The bikers began retreating toward the cabin, their nerves fraying with every step. Luke stayed on their edges, using their fear to his advantage. One of the men, panicked and desperate, broke off from the group and sprinted toward the tree line. He didn't get far before a tripwire sent him sprawling to the ground. Luke emerged from the darkness then, stepping into the moonlight just long enough for the others to see him. He stood tall, a ghostly figure of discipline and resolve, before vanishing again. Brick cursed under his breath. "He's playing us. Damn it, we need to—" Crack. A gunshot rang out, silencing Brick mid-sentence. The bullet wasn't aimed to kill. It struck the ground near his feet, kicking up dirt and making the gang leader stumble back. The message was clear. He wasn't in control anymore. "Leave," Luke's voice called again, calm and firm. "This is your last chance." But Brick's pride wouldn't let him back down. He raised his bat, his face twisted in fury. "Come out and face me, you coward!" Luke emerged then, stepping out of the shadows with his rifle in hand. The moonlight cast harsh angles on his face, making him look more like a specter than a man. "I've faced worse than you," Luke said quietly, his voice steady. "And every single one of them is gone now." Brick charged with a roar, swinging the bat wildly. Luke moved with precision, sidestepping the attack and driving the butt of his rifle into Brick's gut. The gang leader doubled over, gasping for air, but Luke wasn't done. He grabbed Brick by the collar and hauled him close, his eyes cold. "This is over," Luke said, his voice a low growl. "Walk away while you still can." He shoved Brick back, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The remaining bikers hesitated, glancing between their leader and the imposing figure of Luke. They saw the writing on the wall. This wasn't a fight they could win. Brick scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. "Let's go," he snarled, spitting blood onto the ground. "This isn't over, old man." Luke didn't respond. He stood tall, watching as the bikers retreated into the forest, their pride as battered as their bodies. But he knew they'd be back. Brick's ego wouldn't let this end here. As the forest fell silent again, Luke returned to his cabin. He locked the doors and checked his weapons, preparing for the inevitable. This wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a war. And Luke Anderson had no intention of losing. Outside, the distant roar of motorcycles faded into the night. But Luke's instincts told him this was only the beginning. From his spot by the window, he whispered to himself, "They'll come back stronger." And when they did, he'd be ready. The sun rose over the forest, casting long golden rays across the clearing where signs of the previous night's skirmish remained. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and discarded chains told the story of a gang brought low by one man. Luke Anderson sat on the edge of his porch, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The task was routine, mechanical, something to keep his hands busy while his mind ran through the possibilities. The bikers weren't going to stop. Brick had too much to prove, and the men under him had more pride than sense. Luke had seen this kind of tenacity before, on battlefields where stubbornness often got men killed. The difference now was that he had no intention of becoming a casualty. By mid-morning, Luke decided to venture into the nearest town, a small, quiet place with one main street and a few scattered shops. He didn't like leaving his cabin, but supplies were running low, and he needed to be prepared for what was coming. The atmosphere in town was tense as Luke stepped into the general store. The few locals present whispered to each other, their glances darting toward him before quickly looking away. He approached the counter where an older man, Henry, stood nervously adjusting his glasses. "Morning," Luke said evenly, placing a basket of supplies on the counter. "Morning," Henry replied, his voice tight. He hesitated before ringing up the items. "You've, had some visitors out your way, haven't you?" Luke's eyes narrowed. "You've seen them?" Henry nodded, lowering his voice. "They were in town this morning causing trouble, harassing people, drinking in the streets. Brick and his gang, I think they call themselves." Luke's jaw tightened. "They say anything?" Henry hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "They're looking for you, asking anyone if they've seen the crazy old man in the woods. Brick doesn't look like he's letting this go." Luke nodded, sliding cash across the counter. "Stay clear of them, Henry. If they come back, you didn't see me." Henry gave a nervous nod, his hand trembling slightly as he bagged Luke's items. "Take care out there, Luke. Those men aren't just bullies. They're dangerous." As Luke loaded his truck, he caught sight of someone walking toward him from across the street. Mara, the hiker who'd shown up on his property days ago, moved with urgency. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her face was tight with concern. "Luke," she called, quickening her pace. "I heard what happened last night." He paused, squinting at her. "How?" "It's a small town. People talk." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "You can't keep doing this. Brick and his men are escalating. They're not just going to leave you alone." Luke leaned against the truck bed, crossing his arms. "They don't have a choice." Mara frowned. "You don't get it. Brick's got connections. He's not just some local thug. If he wants to make your life hell, he'll find a way to do it." Luke studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Why do you care?" "Because I've seen what happens when people like him get out of control," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It doesn't just stop with you, they'll hurt anyone who gets in their way." Luke's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "I can handle them." Mara looked like she wanted to argue but stopped herself. She shook her head, stepping back. "Just be careful. People like Brick thrive on making others suffer. Don't give him that chance." As the afternoon wore on, Luke returned to his cabin, unloading the supplies and reinforcing his defenses. He was halfway through reinforcing the front door when he heard the faint hum of engines in the distance. He froze, his hand tightening around the hammer. The sound grew louder, closer, until the bikes appeared at the edge of the clearing. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen. Brick rode at the head of the pack, his face twisted into a smug grin. The gang dismounted, spreading out in a loose formation as they advanced on the cabin. Brick carried a shotgun slung over his shoulder, and the others were armed with bats, chains, and crowbars. "Well, look who's still here," Brick called out, his voice echoing through the clearing. "Thought you'd be smart enough to pack up and run, old man." Luke stepped onto the porch, his rifle resting in his hands. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Brick's anger. "This is your last chance," Luke said evenly. "Walk away." Brick laughed, loud and mocking. You think you scare me? You're just one guy, Anderson, and this time you're outnumbered. Luke's expression didn't change. You brought more men, I brought more traps. As if on cue, one of the bikers near the edge of the group stepped on a pressure plate hidden beneath the dirt. A burst of smoke erupted, sending him stumbling back, coughing and swearing. The gang erupted into chaos, some men retreating while others charged forward. Luke raised his rifle. The first shot rang out, striking a bat out of one man's hand. The next shattered the windshield of Brick's prized motorcycle. Luke wasn't aiming to kill, not yet, but every shot sent a clear message. This was his domain, and they weren't welcome. Brick's frustration boiled over as his men faltered. He raised his shotgun, aiming it at the cabin. You think you can take us all down, you crazy bastard? You're done! Luke moved like lightning. He dropped to a knee, took aim, and fired. The shot didn't hit Brick, but instead struck the ground inches from his feet, sending a spray of dirt into the air. Last warning, Luke growled. Leave. Brick hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of Luke's precision. He turned to his men, some of whom were already backing away. We're not done here, he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. Let's go. The gang retreated, their departure marked by the roar of engines and a trail of dust. Luke watched them disappear into the forest, his expression unreadable. He knew they'd be back, but something was different this time. The way Brick had looked at him, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, told Luke the gang leader was starting to understand just how dangerous this fight had become. As silence returned to the forest, Luke lowered his rifle, his gaze scanning the tree line. He knew this was far from over. Brick wasn't just angry now, he was desperate, and desperate men were the most dangerous. Inside the cabin, Luke pulled out a satellite phone from his emergency kit. For years he'd avoided using it, keeping it as a last resort. But now, the situation had escalated beyond what even he could handle alone. He dialed a number, his jaw set. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered on the other end. Colonel Hayes, Luke said, his voice calm but firm. I need a favor. The stage was set, and the stakes had just been raised. The forest held its breath as the sun dipped below the horizon. Luke Anderson sat inside his cabin staring at the satellite phone in his hands. Colonel Hayes, his former commanding officer, had listened without interruption as Luke explained the escalating situation. When Luke finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. You always had a way of finding trouble, Anderson, Hayes finally said. Or maybe it always found you. This isn't trouble, Luke replied evenly. It's a threat. I need intel on these bikers, Brick's connections, and who's backing them. If they've got resources, I need to know how deep they run. Hayes exhaled, the sound crackling faintly over the line. Give me a few hours. I'll see what I can dig up. In the meantime, keep your head down. These types don't play fair. Luke smirked. Neither do I. While Luke waited, he began reinforcing his cabin further, layering the traps and defenses he had already set. His movements were swift and deliberate, each step a dance of precision honed by years of military experience. The hum of an approaching car broke his focus. It wasn't the roar of bikes, but the steady growl of a vehicle climbing the forest road. Luke stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, as Mara's old pickup truck came into view. She pulled to a stop, hopping out with a backpack slung over one shoulder. I told you to stay away, Luke said, his tone more matter-of-fact than unkind. Mara crossed her arms, her chin set stubbornly. And I told you Brick isn't going to stop. So I brought supplies. She gestured to the truck bed, which held cans of fuel, a box of nails, and a stack of reinforced planks. Luke's lips twitched, almost a smile. You think that's going to stop them? No, she said, stepping closer. But I think you can. If you're going to stand your ground, you might as well have some backup. Luke regarded her for a long moment. Her resolve reminded him of soldiers he'd served with, courageous but untrained, ready to charge into the unknown. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Unload it then, he said, and stay out of the line of fire. By nightfall, the satellite phone buzzed to life. Luke answered immediately, his voice calm but expectant. "I've got your intel," Hayes said. "Brick's gang is more than just a pack of unruly bikers. They're tied to a regional drug syndicate. Mid-level players moving shipments across state lines. Brick's a wannabe kingpin, but his crew is connected to some serious hitters." Luke's jaw tightened. "And you're just now hearing about this?" "They're small enough to stay under the radar, but big enough to be dangerous," Hayes replied. "Word is they've been trying to expand their operations into new territory, and your property might be a key location for their routes." Luke's hand clenched the phone. It all made sense now. Why the gang wouldn't back off. Why Brick was so desperate to intimidate him into submission. "Anything else I need to know?" Luke asked. Hayes hesitated. "Yeah. Brick's got a man in town feeding him information, someone close enough to keep tabs on you." Luke's stomach turned, his mind flashing to Mara. Could she be involved? He pushed the thought away. No, her concern seemed genuine, but if not her, then who? "I'll handle it," Luke said. "Thanks for the intel." "You're not alone in this," Hayes added. "I've got a team standing by if things go south." Luke shook his head. "Not yet. If I need you, I'll call." "Just don't wait too long," Hayes warned before disconnecting. Unbeknownst to Luke, Brick and his gang were already planning their next move. At a remote warehouse on the outskirts of town, the bikers gathered around a table littered with maps and empty beer bottles. Brick slammed a fist onto the table, silencing the murmurs. "We're taking that cabin tonight," he growled. "Anderson's had his fun, but this ends now." "What's the play?" Axel, one of Brick's lieutenants, asked. Brick grinned, his teeth glinting under the flickering light. "We burn it to the ground. No more traps, no more games." The gang erupted in cheers, their confidence bolstered by the promise of destruction. But as they loaded up their bikes, a shadow lingered in the corner, a man in plain clothes, his phone pressed to his ear. "They're moving out now," the man whispered. "Hope your guy's ready." Luke stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the first flicker of headlights through the trees. Mara was inside the cabin, tending to a makeshift communication system they'd rigged to monitor the perimeter. "How many?" she asked through the radio. "All of them," Luke replied. "Looks like Brick brought his entire crew." The engines roared closer, and Luke retreated into the shadows. He knew the bikers would focus their attention on the cabin first, thinking they had the upper hand. That's where they'd make their first mistake. As the gang rolled into the clearing, Brick shouted orders, his voice carrying over the rumble of engines. "Spread out. Surround the place. No one gets in or out." Luke waited until the bikers were fully committed before springing his first trap. A concealed log trap swung down from the trees, slamming into two bikes and sending their riders sprawling. The rest of the gang scattered, shouting curses and revving their engines. Brick fired his shotgun into the air, silencing the chaos. "It's just another one of his tricks," he bellowed. "Get to the cabin!" The bikers charged forward, their weapons raised, but the ground beneath them erupted with smoke and fire. Luke had rigged several tripwire explosives, disorienting the gang and forcing them to regroup. From his hidden vantage point, Luke picked off stragglers with precise shots, aiming to incapacitate rather than kill. He wanted them scared, not dead, at least for now. Inside the cabin, Mara watched the chaos unfold on the monitors, her heart pounding. She grabbed the radio, her voice trembling. "Luke, they're regrouping. Brick's heading for the front door." "Let him come," Luke replied, his voice cold. "I've got something special for him." Through the haze of smoke and fire, Brick marched toward the cabin, his shotgun clenched in both hands. He kicked open the front door, shouting, "Where are you, old man?" The silence inside was deafening. Brick took a step forward, his boots crunching on the wooden floor, and then, from the shadows, Luke's voice echoed. "You walked into the wrong house, Brick." Before Brick could react, a shadow lunged toward him, and the true battle began. Brick spun, his shotgun raised, but Luke was already in motion. The former soldier struck with calculated precision, knocking the barrel aside as the shotgun fired harmlessly into the floor. Brick staggered back, and Luke closed the distance, driving his shoulder into Brick's chest and sending the gang leader crashing into the wall. The cabin shuddered with the impact. But Luke didn't relent. He followed up with a swift punch to Brick's jaw, his knuckles cracking against bone. Brick roared, swinging wildly with a crowbar he'd grabbed from the floor. Luke ducked, the makeshift weapon slicing through the air above his head. "You should have walked away," Luke growled, his voice low and dangerous. Outside, the remaining bikers were regrouping. Explosions and traps had scattered them, but they were determined to press forward. Mara watched on the monitors, her fingers trembling over the radio. "Luke, more are heading your way," she warned. "Stay where you are," Luke replied, his voice calm despite the chaos. Brick took advantage of the momentary distraction, throwing his weight into Luke and slamming him against a table. The two men grappled, their combined strength sending objects crashing to the floor. Brick sneered, his breath hot and foul. "You're not as tough as you think, old man." Luke smirked through gritted teeth. "Neither are you." With a sharp twist, Luke broke free, delivering a brutal knee to Brick's stomach. The gang leader doubled over, coughing violently. Before he could recover, Luke grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the wall again. "This ends now," Luke said, his voice cold as steel. The cabin door burst open and two bikers charged in, armed and yelling. Luke released Brick and spun, his knife flashing in the dim light. The first man swung a bat, but Luke sidestepped, driving the knife into the attacker's shoulder. The man screamed, dropping the weapon as he stumbled back. The second biker hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. Luke turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "You want to walk out of here alive?" The biker nodded, dropping his weapon and backing toward the door. "Then get out," Luke said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man bolted, dragging his injured companion with him. Brick snarled from behind, grabbing a broken chair leg and swinging it at Luke. This time Luke caught the weapon mid-swing, wrenching it from Brick's hands and shoving him hard against the wall. Outside, the roar of engines grew louder, but these weren't the bikers. Mara peered through the monitors, her eyes widening. A convoy of unmarked SUVs barreled into the clearing, headlights blazing. Men in tactical gear spilled out, their rifles raised and commands sharp. Mara grabbed the radio. "Luke, Hayes sent backup." Luke didn't respond. He had Brick pinned to the wall, his forearm pressing against the gang leader's throat. "Your men are finished," Luke said. "Call them off." Brick sneered. "You think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with." Luke leaned closer, his voice a deadly whisper. "And you don't know who you've been messing with." Brick tried to push back, but the fight had drained from him. The sound of gunfire and shouting outside signaled the swift dismantling of the remaining bikers. Luke released Brick, letting him crumple to the floor, gasping for air. The cabin door swung open, and Colonel Hayes stepped in, his presence commanding. "Anderson," he greeted, his voice calm. "Looks like you had a party." Luke turned, nodding. "A messy one." Hayes gestured to the tactical team sweeping the area. "We've rounded up the rest of them. The gang's done. And Brick will face federal charges along with his syndicate contacts. Good work holding them off." Luke glanced at Brick, who was being handcuffed by one of Hayes' men. "This wasn't just about holding them off," Luke said. "It was about sending a message." The sun was rising by the time the tactical teams cleared out, taking the bikers into custody. The clearing was quiet again, save for the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Luke stood on the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he surveyed the damage. Mara stepped out of the cabin, her face pale but resolute. "Is it over?" she asked. Luke nodded slowly. "For now." She crossed her arms, her gaze sweeping the wreckage. "You could have left, you know, found a place far away from all this." Luke shook his head. "Running doesn't solve problems. Standing your ground does." Mara studied him for a moment before offering a small, tired smile. "Well, I'm glad you stood yours. The town owes you a lot." Luke didn't reply. He watched as Hayes approached, the colonel's expression unreadable. "What now?" Luke asked. Hayes shrugged. "Brick and his crew will face the justice they deserve. You've bought yourself some peace, at least for a while." Luke nodded, his jaw tightening. "And the syndicate?" Hayes' gaze hardened. "They'll be dealt with. This operation gave us the foothold we needed to bring them down. Luke considered this before looking out at the forest. Good. Make sure they know not to come back. Days passed, and life in the forest returned to its usual rhythm. Luke repaired the damage to his cabin, each nail and plank a step toward reclaiming the peace he had fought so hard to protect. Mara visited occasionally, bringing supplies and updates from town. The locals, she said, now spoke of Luke with hushed reverence, their respect for the old man in the woods, a stark contrast to their earlier unease. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the forest in hues of amber and gold, Luke sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. His eyes scanned the horizon, the habit of a man who would never fully leave the battlefield behind. The satellite phone buzzed on the table beside him. He picked it up, his expression unreadable as he answered. "Luke," Hayes said on the other end, "I've got another situation. Could use someone with your expertise." Luke exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the tree line. After a long pause, he replied, "Send me the details." As the call ended, Luke set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. The forest was quiet, but he knew that peace was always fleeting. And when the next battle came, he'd be ready. The forest was still as the day's light faded, shadows stretching long across the clearing. Luke sat on his porch, his rifle resting beside him, and a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The calm around him was hard-earned, every tree and blade of grass a silent witness to the battle that had unfolded just days earlier. The bikers were gone, their hold on the town shattered. Colonel Hayes had ensured Brick and his crew would face justice, and the syndicate they were tied to had been exposed. But Luke knew better than to think the fight was truly over. The scars left by violence didn't fade quickly, and peace was something that required constant vigilance. Still, for now, the wilderness was his again, a sanctuary for a man who had long ago learned to carry his battles within. Mara's truck rolled up the dirt road and she stepped out, a hesitant smile on her face. She held up a small basket. "I brought you something. Thought you could use some real food after all this." Luke gave a rare smile, gesturing for her to sit. As she joined him on the porch, they sat in companionable silence, the kind that spoke of mutual respect and unspoken gratitude. Finally, she broke the quiet. "Do you ever think about leaving this place? Going somewhere easier?" Luke shook his head. "This is where I'm meant to be. You don't find peace by running from the fight. You find it by standing your ground." Mara nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Well, I'm glad you stayed. I think the whole town is." As the last rays of sunlight faded, Luke sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't say it, but the truth was clear in his steady demeanor. No matter how many battles came his way, he'd be ready. If you were moved by Luke's story of resilience and justice, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the strength we all carry within. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of courage, redemption, and the unyielding spirit of those who fight for what's right. And remember, true strength isn't about winning every battle. It's about never giving up. Join us next time as we uncover another tale that inspires and challenges us to stand tall, no matter what comes our way. Like, comment, and subscribe to support stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. What would you have done in